October 12th, 1943. Office of the Director of Air Armament, Berlin. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Oberst Ludwig von Kleist held the flimsy piece of photographic paper as if it were contaminated. The grainy aerial image showed the Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan, a sprawling, monstrous complex of concrete and steel that the analysts had codenamed the Colossus. The accompanying report, sourced from a Swedish electrical engineer who had toured the facility, contained numbers that defied all German industrial logic. 1,500,000 parts, von Kleist read aloud, his voice a low, disbelieving rasp. He looked across his desk at his subordinate, Hauptmann Ernst Fischer, a man known for his unshakable calm. That calm was now gone. They are claiming that this automobile factory is assembling a heavy bomber from 1.5 million individual components. And they are doing it not once a week, not once a day, but every hour, every single hour of the working day. He let the paper fall. Fischer, this is not intelligence. This is psychosis. Fischer shifted his weight. Herr Oberst, the source is reliable. He provided schematics for their new hydraulic riveting system. The mathematics, while extraordinary, are consistent. Our agents in Mexico City have intercepted American shipping manifests that show a flow of raw materials into Michigan and finished aircraft out to England that can only support such a production rate. The Japanese attaché in Washington, a man we know to be meticulous, has filed an identical assessment. They are all saying the same thing. Von Kleist stood and walked to the large window overlooking the Wilhelmstrasse. The city below moved with the grim, purposeful rhythm of a nation at total war. Do you understand what you are asking me to believe? You are asking me to believe that the Americans, a mongrel race of shopkeepers and farmers, a people who could not even manage their own economy a decade ago, have achieved an industrial miracle that surpasses the combined output of the entire Reich. You are asking me to believe that Henry Ford, a man who publishes anti-Semitic tracts we find even too crude for our own use, has somehow marshaled a workforce of women and Negroes to a level of efficiency that humbles our most disciplined German engineers. He turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury. This is not a failure of intelligence gathering, Fischer. This is a failure of analysis. The Americans are feeding us a narrative. They have turned our agents, or they have created this entire elaborate fiction to provoke panic and force us to divert resources. It is a brilliant psychological operation, but it is a fiction. But the reconnaissance flights, Fischer began hesitantly. Show buildings, von Kleist snapped. They show buildings and parking lots filled with the cars of workers. They do not show a bomber rolling off a line every 63 minutes. It is a physical impossibility. The tolerances required for a strategic bomber, the skilled labor for the engines, the electrical systems, the armaments, it cannot be done by assembly line workers. It is a lie, a magnificent, terrifying lie, but a lie nonetheless. He returned to his desk and picked up the report again. I will take this to the Reichsmarshal, but I will attach my own assessment, and my assessment will state that while the Americans are undoubtedly increasing their production, these figures are a deliberate exaggeration, a weapon of propaganda designed to erode our will. To believe otherwise is to admit that we have already lost the war in the factories, and if we have lost there, then the war itself is a foregone conclusion. And that, Hauptmann, is a thought I will not entertain. He scrawled a signature across the bottom of the document, a signature that would condemn the report as unreliable, and dropped it into his out tray. The truth, a truth built of mathematics, logistics, and the raw power of American industry, had just been deemed impossible by the one man with the power to act on it. And in that moment, in a quiet office in Berlin, the fate of the Third Reich was sealed not by a battle, but by an ideology that could not comprehend the reality staring it in the face. The truth, the reality that Oberst von Kleist had so vehemently rejected, was not only possible, it was already thundering into existence on the other side of the Atlantic. The Willow Run bomber plant, conceived in a moment of desperation and built with an audacity that defied all conventional wisdom, was more than just a factory. It was a statement, a declaration that the United States would not merely participate in the war, but would dominate it through the sheer, overwhelming force of its industrial might. The story of Willow Run begins not with blueprints or excavation, but with a crisis. In 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a seemingly impossible demand to American industry: produce 50,000 aircraft per year. The existing aerospace manufacturers, companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated, were artisanal shops by comparison, building planes in small batches with highly skilled labor. They could not scale to meet such a target. The solution had to come from a different world entirely, the world of mass production. The administration turned to the man who had invented modern mass production, Henry Ford. Ford was initially reluctant. He was an isolationist, and his notorious anti-Semitism made him sympathetic to aspects of the Nazi regime. But he was also a man consumed by a challenge. When Charles Sorensen, Ford's legendary production chief, visited the Consolidated aircraft plant in San Diego, he watched as B-24 Liberators were being built with painstaking slowness. Sorensen, a man who thought in terms of moving assembly lines and minute-by-minute production cycles, saw chaos. He famously picked up a piece of chalk and sketched out the entire floor plan of a proposed factory directly onto the concrete floor of an empty field in Michigan. It would be a single continuous building over a mile long where bombers would flow from one end to the other like automobiles, growing from a collection of parts into a finished warplane. The site chosen was a tract of land near Ypsilanti, Michigan, known as Willow Run, after a small creek that meandered through it. The name would soon become synonymous with American industrial power. The construction was a monumental undertaking. The main building stretched for 3,200 feet, more than half a mile. It contained over 5 million square feet of floor space under a single roof. To clear the land, to pour the concrete, to erect the steel frame, required an army of construction workers who lived in temporary shanty towns, facing mud, shortages, and brutal deadlines. The project was plagued with problems, earning it the early nickname, "Will it run?" Skepticism was rampant, both in Washington and within the Ford Motor Company itself. But Ford and Sorensen were relentless. They applied the principles of the automotive assembly line to the most complex machine of its time. The B-24 Liberator was a notoriously difficult aircraft to build. It was bigger and more complicated than the B-17, with a high aspect ratio Davis wing that offered great lift and range, but was a structural challenge to manufacture. It had a twin-tail design and a fuselage that was less rounded, more angular than its Boeing counterpart. Where traditional aircraft manufacturing relied on master craftsmen, Ford broke the bomber down into its 1.5 million components and designed a system where unskilled or semi-skilled workers could perform simple, repetitive tasks with flawless precision. The scale of the logistics was staggering. Raw materials, aluminum, steel, copper, rubber, flowed in by rail at one end of the plant. These were transformed into sub-assemblies in dedicated areas. The wing section, a critical component, was built on its own massive fixture and then moved through the factory on an overhead conveyor. The fuselage was built in sections that were joined together as they moved down the line. Engines, propellers, instruments, and armaments were fed into the main line from feeder lines, a symphony of coordinated delivery that had to be timed to the minute. A single delay in a single component could halt the entire mile-long procession. The workforce was as revolutionary as the process. With millions of men joining the armed forces, the labor pool was drained. The solution was to recruit those whom German ideology deemed incapable of such work: women and African Americans. Over 11,000 women worked at Willow Run, becoming the iconic Rosie the Riveters. They operated massive machine tools, drove forklifts, and performed the intricate wiring that brought the bombers to life. They were not just assistants, they were the backbone of the production line. Thousands of African Americans, many of whom had migrated from the South in the Great Migration, found work at Willow Run. Though they often faced segregation and discrimination, even as they built the weapons of democracy. This diverse workforce was a living repudiation of the Nazi dogma of a master race. It was meritocracy on an industrial scale, and it was devastatingly effective. The production cadence that so baffled German intelligence was the result of this perfect, if often chaotic, marriage of process and people. The goal was not just to build bombers, but to build them at a pace that would overwhelm the enemy's capacity to destroy them. The 63-minute figure was not a random boast. It was the calculated takt time of the final assembly line. Once the plant hit its stride in 1944, a finished B-24, painted, armed, and ready for flight, would emerge from the end of the line at that relentless interval. They came out so fast that the adjacent airfield, one of the largest in the world, couldn't always park them all. Pilots of the Ferry Command would land, taxi to the end of the plant, and a brand new bomber, still smelling of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid, would be rolled out and handed over to them. They would then fly it across the country and eventually across the Atlantic to join the air war over Europe. The psychological impact of this production was twofold. For the Allies, Willow Run was a symbol of hope and invincibility. Every newspaper article about the bomber every hour plant was a morale booster. For the Axis, it was a looming, incomprehensible threat. The Japanese, after their defeat at Midway, understood the power of American industry in a way the Germans refused to. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States, had famously warned against awakening a sleeping giant. Willow Run was that giant, now fully awake and building a fist capable of crushing entire nations. Yet back in Berlin, the reports continued to be dismissed. The Nazi leadership, from Hitler and Göring on down, were prisoners of their own worldview. They believed that will and racial purity were the ultimate determinants of victory. The concept of a pluralistic democracy outproducing their militarized state was not just unlikely, it was heretical. They attributed the reports to Allied propaganda, believing that no society they considered degenerate and weak could possibly achieve such feats. This was not a simple intelligence failure. It was a catastrophic failure of imagination and ideology. They were fighting a war of the 19th century against an enemy that had perfected the art of 20th century industrial warfare. They were counting tanks and divisions, while their enemy was counting production lines and man-hours. The ultimate vindication of Willow Run would be written in the skies over Germany and in the final accounting of the war. By the time the last B-24 rolled out of the plant in June 1945, Willow Run had produced 8,685 aircraft. This was nearly half of all the B-24s built during the entire war. The plant's total output constituted a full 2% of all American war production. The B-24s from Willow Run and other plants served in every theater of the war, from the Plosti oil fields in Romania to the submarine pens in the Atlantic, from the jungles of the Pacific to the beaches of Normandy. They delivered millions of tons of bombs, sank U-boats, and transported troops and supplies. They were, quite literally, the aircraft that helped strangle the German war machine. The legacy of Willow Run is a powerful lesson that transcends its time. It demonstrates that the true engine of military power is not just the courage of soldiers, but the ingenuity, organization, and productive capacity of the nation behind them. It proved that a diverse workforce, empowered and trained, could achieve the impossible, and it stands as a permanent testament to the fatal flaw of totalitarian thinking, its inability to process facts that contradict its core beliefs. The German spies were right. The mathematics were correct. A bomber was being built every 63 minutes. But in the end, the Nazis chose ideology over arithmetic. And in a total war of production, that is a miscalculation from which there is no recovery. The story of Willow Run is the story of how democracy, for all its messiness and chaos, can mobilize its people and its principles to achieve what rigid closed societies can only dismiss as a fantasy, until that fantasy arrives overhead in a sky black with bombers. Until that fantasy arrives overhead in a sky black with bombers, a sky that was no longer contested but owned. This was the final, brutal arithmetic the Reich had refused to learn. The very ideology that fueled their war machine, the belief in a singular, superior way of organizing humanity, blinded them to the adaptable, decentralized, and raw problem-solving power of the system they sought to destroy. The operational impact of this industrial output was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative in its sheer scale. German flak batteries, once capable of concentrating fire on a few hundred bombers, now faced formations of 1,000 aircraft or more. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, the once vaunted aces, were now overwhelmed by numbers. A pilot could shoot down 1, 2, even 3 bombers in a single pass, but there would always be a 4th, a 5th, a 6th to take its place. The replacements were not just men, but the machines themselves. A German pilot who survived being shot down was a valuable, irreplaceable asset. An American pilot who bailed out over friendly territory could be back in the cockpit within weeks, flying a brand new aircraft that had rolled off a line that had never paused, never slowed. The war became one of attrition, and in such a war, the side with the deepest reserves of material and the most robust pipeline for its replacement holds an unbeatable advantage. This was the cruel lesson of the production war that was fought not in the skies over Berlin, but in the boardrooms of Detroit and on the factory floors of Michigan. The German High Command had meticulously planned for a conflict of maneuver and encirclement, a replay of the blitzkrieg that had shattered France. They had not planned for a war against an opponent who could absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger the next day, and the day after that. The reports from Willow Run were not just statistics. They were a preview of this new form of warfare. A factory that could lose an entire day's production to an accident or sabotage, and still, through its sheer scale and redundancy, make up the lost ground in a matter of days, was a strategic weapon unlike any the world had seen. The psychological toll on the German warfighter was immense. A soldier on the Eastern Front might never see an American factory, but he felt its output in the relentless artillery barrages that never seemed to run short of shells. A U-boat commander stalking convoys in the Atlantic felt it in the ever-increasing number of escort vessels and the long-range patrol aircraft that made his hunting grounds perilous. For the civilian population, the reality arrived in the form of the contrails of the bomber streams, not dozens, but hundreds, then thousands, eclipsing the sun. The air raid sirens wailed not for a nuisance raid, but for a cataclysm of high explosives and incendiaries delivered with a consistency that suggested an inexhaustible supply. The will to resist, a resource the Nazi leadership believed was infinite in the German Volk, began to erode under this constant, grinding pressure. It is one thing to endure hardship for a cause you believe you can win. It is another to endure it in the face of an enemy whose capacity for violence appears limitless. The final tragic irony lies in the post-war analysis. When Allied intelligence teams swept through the ruins of the German Air Ministry in the Abwehr headquarters, they found the files. They found the meticulously typed reports from the Mexican agents, the detailed schematics from the Swedish engineers, the sober assessments from the Japanese naval attachés. They were all there, filed and catalogued, each one stamped with the official seal of the Third Reich. And next to them were the internal memoranda from men like Oberst von Kleist, the dismissive analyses that labeled the truth as enemy deception. The evidence of their own impending defeat had been in their hands for years, and they had chosen, as a matter of doctrine, to disbelieve it. The story of Willow Run, therefore, is more than a tale of industrial achievement. It is a permanent case study in the dangers of ideological rigidity. It demonstrates that the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world is useless if the leadership is cognitively incapable of accepting the data it produces. The Nazis were not defeated because they lacked information. They were defeated because the information they possessed did not fit their worldview, and so they discarded it. They believed that willpower could triumph over production schedules, that racial purity could out-innovate diverse collaboration, that a closed, hierarchical system could outperform an open, chaotic, and fiercely competitive one. In the end, the mathematics did win. The equation was simple. One bomber every 63 minutes, multiplied by 24 hours, multiplied by days and months and years, equals an unstoppable force. The sky did turn black with bombers, and beneath that sky, an empire built on a lie of racial and ideological supremacy crumbled into dust and memory. A stark lesson for any future power that would ever dare to underestimate the formidable, world-altering power of a free people united in common purpose and armed with the tools of industry. The roar of the B-24's engines was the sound of that equation being solved once and for all.